Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kim Schmidt, the executive editor of Farm Equipment Magazine. Welcome to our latest webinar, Future Proof Your Dealership, Define What's Next Before It Defines You, in conjunction with Pinion. Today's presenter is Mark Johnson. Mark proactively counsels business owners on financial and tax matters in order to position them well for growth and business succession. He works primarily with equipment dealerships through the United States and has over 20 years of experience. Before Mark gets started with his presentation, just a couple of housekeeping items. On your screen, there's a control panel with a Q&A icon. You can submit questions here at any time during the presentation, and then we will try to answer as many of those as possible at the end of Mark's presentation. And then, as always, we are recording today's webinar in case you want to share it with anyone after the fact, and we will make sure to send it out to you to rewatch whenever you want. With that, we are ready to get started. Thanks again for joining us, and you can take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Kim. Kim and I were just discussing before everybody got on how many people watch these versus how many watch them on tape. And for those of you that are watching later, I welcome also. But glad to have you here. It's Memorial Day weekend, so kind of a short week, kind of maybe a strange week to have one of these webinars, but very good topic at hand here to talk about today. Just real quick about who I work for. Pinion, we used to be called Kennedy & Co. long ago, then we were Keiko Isom. We recently just changed our name about a year and a half ago to Pinion. Same people own it, same business, so we're the same people that you know. Just real quick, we're an accounting consulting firm at heart. All of my clients look exactly like all the people on the call today. Dealerships all across the country. You can see I got offices around the country. I'm based in Kansas City most of the time, and get out to see my clients from there. And the topic today is one that we work very much with our clients on, whether it is looking at strategic planning or estate planning or succession planning. There's always some kind of futuristic thought about what can I be as a dealer tomorrow versus resting on what happened yesterday. And so we're going to get into that a little bit today. So I show this slide just to show you I've got a little bit of expertise in the matter at hand. So you can listen intently or not intently, but feel free to ask questions. I think Kim will keep track of those, and we'll ask, and we'll take them here at the end. So real quick, today's topic, the marketing people do a great job of putting a title on something that makes me scramble a little bit. And the future proofing your dealership, I got to thinking, today's the two topics that are very near and dear to me. One is the future. I'm generally an optimistic person. I'm always thinking tomorrow might bring something a little bit better than today did. At least it'll be more exciting and it'll be different than today anyway. And so I can kind of look forward to that. And the second one being control. I've been accused of this being one of my most pronounced spiritual gifts of being a control freak. I take that as a good thing. I think it's usually given to me as a matter of coaching, but I'll take it anyway. But when the two are put together, the future and control, generally we're much less optimistic and much less in control than what we were thinking about when we thought about the two separately. Whether it's George Orwell or George Lucas or whoever wrote a futuristic doomsday movie, those doomsday movies kind of let us think that the future is going to be controlled by someone else. We're going to be wielded over by somebody, and while the good might ultimately overcome the bad, we might have to go through some pretty rough times to get to that good part. And then we have Cold War and zombie visions of the end of the world and most of the future books. And then even Ben Franklin, good old Ben Franklin, he's the one that kind of gave us his account is probably one of the best known quotes about the future. And that being, the only thing certain in life is death and taxes. Well, as an accountant and an optimistic person, what a terrible mantra for me to have to speak about death and taxes. So we're going to take a little different bent. Let's think a little more positive. Michael J. Fox or George Jetson or any of those more positive things we want to think about why we want to get to the future and experience tomorrow. And if we want to circle this back to the business and kind of the topic today, Peter Drucker, pretty famous business book writer, wrote The Effective Executive and some others. He's also kind of known as the father of management, one of the first business futurists. Well, he has a quote here that long-range planning does not deal with the future decisions, but with the future of present decisions. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today is what decisions could we be making or should we be making today to future-proof our business, to make sure we stay in control of our future, to make sure that it's not just about death and taxes, and something more exciting. In fact, I would like to think that the future you or the future of your dealership also has much more certainties than death and taxes. It's also certainly going to face change. It's certainly going to have opportunity, expansion, succession. You're going to have retirements along the way, at least yours, and maybe you'll even let some other people experience that along the way. With expansion and opportunity, sometimes we think about that as little in negative terms as consolidation, unless you're the consolidator, and even that doesn't need to be that way, because expansion and growth. There's a quote from Mandy Hale that's very appropriate. She says, "Growth is painful, change is painful, but nothing is as painful as being stuck somewhere you don't belong." And I think that's very appropriate in business to think, this just doesn't feel right. I'm not the right size. I'm not positioned right for this person leaving or that person leaving. My capital structure isn't right. My taxes aren't right. Whatever that is, if we're stuck in a spot that we need to change something, we just gotta bite the bullet and do it. And then you think back to Peter Drucker's comment. Let's get some of that stuff in place. Decisions made today that'll affect our future. And so that's what we're going to focus on today. So as far as the whole defining your what's next before it's defined for you, I think the takeaways and the agenda today let's talk a little bit about what's next for dealerships, why transition planning matters, some of the common challenges and triggers, and some essential steps you need to take to get there. Now, for those of you that have gone through some succession planning or some strategic planning in your business before, some of today might be a little bit of a reminder. Some of it might be kind of oh yeah, I had that checklist of things that the accountant or the attorney told me I needed to take care of, and maybe you didn't get them all taken care of. Maybe this will put it back at front and center on your list to get those things taken care of. But if nothing else, it'll be a good tutorial to remind you why you did what you did. For those of you that haven't done any succession or strategic planning, then today might kind of light that fire to get to motivate you to get going on the process. Certainly, this is a process that is very difficult to do on your own. You're going to need the help of people in your company and outside of your company, whether it's professionals like myself, or whether it's your mentors or your friends that you trust and things like that. There are definitely some steps that you need to take that you can't just do it on your own. So let's talk about what's next for dealerships. Certainly change. If I think about the last 2019 to now, I think change would be an understatement. We've seen from a farm equipment dealership perspective, we've seen corn prices from 2020 to 2022 go up $2 plus a bushel, and then right after that we saw them fall the same $2 a bushel, so that now we're back down under way under $5 and approaching to be under $4. And for those of you that have got any history with a farm equipment dealership, you know that $4 and $5 corn are some pretty important numbers for us to know what our future looks like. At $4 corn, we still sell inventory. At $5 corn, we run out of inventory, and that's kind of what happened in 2020 and 2020 through 2022. So our inventory, that's another thing that we saw change. From we went from a period of we had way too much to having way too little, and now we're at a period of way too much again. For those of you, particularly in the Midwest and the big row crop farming states, you're looking at your used inventory right now out in the parking lot and on your spreadsheets and saying, "Wow, where did all these combines come from? I needed them a couple years ago. I didn't have them then." I had the same with planters and big four-wheel drives. We just all of a sudden we have a lot of inventory again, and we're starting to deal with that. Manufacturers right now are warning our dealers that the amount of capital that you're going to need inside your dealership is just going to be growing and growing over the next few years, whether that's technology or precision ag or whatever it is that your OEM is kind of saying, "Hey, we want you to focus on this." The one thing we know is it's going to take capital to do that. That's either capital that you're leaving in the business, profits that you made that you don't take out, or if you didn't make enough profits to fund that, then you're having to put money in from prior profits. And that's kind of what we're seeing this year, particularly, is we're having to give some of what we made back over the last couple of years because our capital is starting to get stretched thin. We've seen new machine prices and parts prices go up 20% a year. Didn't get any input from us, right? We probably would have raised the price a little bit, but I don't know if we would have raised it 20%, but all inflation was going that way. And so all those machines and parts went up. which made our used inventory trade-ins go up, and now we're stuck with a bunch of used inventory that we traded for way too high, and we got to figure out how to right size that. I know my dealers right now, year-to-date results through May are not pretty. We've seen our margins completely erode, not back to pre-COVID levels of, back in the terrible days in the 2010 to the 2014, that run up in there where we literally, budgeted for 0% margin on used inventory. We're not all the way back there, but we've gone from 9, 10, 12% used margin inventories back down to 2, 3, 4%, and it's really killing us. So year-to-date profits are not good in our dealerships, which means our year-to-date cash flow is also not good. I'm having just tons of dealers call me every day about if they've done some cash flow analysis and they're like, help me understand what this is going to look like in the future. Where's my inventory going? Help me understand. Help me better forecast this. If they haven't done anything, they're calling and saying, where the heck did all my cash go? Because from 2020 to 2022, we just kept building and building cash, and then we started using cash, and now all of a sudden we're back down to kind of those levels that certainly aren't abundant in cash anymore. So on the page I've listed some others here. There's all kinds of change that you guys are facing, and to me, I think the change that we're seeing is really just starting, and really. Change is inevitable. It's gonna, just about the time you think you got everything figured out, that's when something changes anyway. So that's kind of the point of today as well. All right, so I'm going to talk about our opportunity expansion and consolidation kind of all together. Now you see that there on the left. Obviously, it depends on who you are as a dealership and who you are as a dealership leader, to see where you're at in that regard. But to me, opportunity expansion, consolidation, they're all kind of the same thing that we need to talk about, kind of the same thing at the same time. If you don't know who you are, whether you're a buyer or a seller, for instance, then that's something you need to get resolved pretty soon. Because if it hasn't already, you're going to start getting phone calls. Those phone calls are going to come from your OEM. They're going to come from your competition, from private equity brokers, and various other people who are trying to define their future. And their future probably includes having you in their portfolio, quite possibly. And so before they make that call and before you have to deal with understanding that call, it's kind of important for you to define yourself before that happens. So what are we talking about? The definition options for you right now. Maybe you're content. Okay, content is fine. I'm big enough where I'm at. I'm in the right spots. I like how I am. That's one thing. Able to continue in your contentedness is a different thing. Your OEM might have a different thought process. Your cash flow and your capital might have a different demand, and so we need to figure out who we are in there. Content is fine as long as we're able to do that. Are we a buyer or seller? That sounds pretty simple, but it's not as simple as it used to be. Some of the transactions that I've helped with this year in the M&A space look completely different than any transaction we've done in the past. It's guys clear across the country, buying guys clear across the country, merging those dealerships in and having two AORs that are hundreds or thousands of miles apart, and running those separately. And so that has changed a little bit. Are you interested in M&A? And specifically in M&A, are you interested in being only a majority owner? Or could you see yourself as a minority owner where somebody else has the majority of the ownership, makes the majority of the decisions, has most of the majority of the seats on the board and all those kind of things? Or are you okay with saying, I've had my run. I still want to be in control. I don't want to take my capital anywhere else. Or I don't mind not being in control, but I don't want to take my capital anywhere else. So I like being you name the brand dealer, and I just want to kind of stay here, and I'm fine doing that as a minority owner. It's definitely not as negative as the term sounds, being the minority owner in a merger and acquisition, but it does come with its challenges. And on those challenges, then post transaction, is that something that I see as my ability to continue in a role, maybe grow in a role, change a little bit, or is that my opportunity to exit and kind of monetize the investment my family's put into this dealership for all these years, and I just take the money and go out into the sunset. And then finally, most of those roles are kind of about where do you define your dealership in, but along the way, you also need to define your role in that dealership. Are you in a role that can transition? So for instance, if you are interested in being a minority owner in an M&A and you're a CEO, that role can transition, but it most likely won't be the CEO. in the bigger organization. And so, are you able to transition your role? Are you willing to transition? Are you willing to learn some new skills or go back to some old skills and kind of change your role up? So those are all the definitions that are available to you in opportunity expansion consolidation. But all of them have to be based on something. They can't just be, oh man, when I grow up, I want to be a professional baseball player and I can't play baseball worth a darn. That doesn't work, right? We have to base all these on some kind of fact. So all of the above definitions are all based on what is the capital and specifically what does the leverage look like in your dealership? Can you grow to that next step? Can you afford to be a buyer? Is your debt such that if you were a seller, there might not be anything left? You're so leveraged that this isn't the time to sell. We got to take care of some things before we can put ourselves on the market. Do we have the leadership to do this? More and more I've found that in the most successful M&A transactions start with culture. They don't do culture at the end and say, okay, got all the finances to work. Now can we make the people thing work? Do we have the right leaders in place? Do we have the right culture to make this thing kind of go from a 5-store dealer to a 10-store dealer? Because if you don't have that in place, then the transaction probably isn't going to work. If you don't have leadership, in fact, we often see that your valuation on your company is impacted. So that's one of the things that we look at when we're valuing a company is, do we have leadership that can go to the next level, or are we already have some spots that we need to fill in? So part of our profit in the past has been based on the fact that we've got some kind of deferred maintenance in our leadership. What's our market share look like? Depending on which OEM that you're a dealer for, the transactions might not get approved if your market share is below certain levels, or transactions might get hurried. And you're told to do something quicker than you would have otherwise if your market share isn't where it's meant to be. Now, I have a feeling that market share discussions are going to change a little bit this year, at least. As we see the manufacturers kind of going through some pretty major layoffs and going through some pretty major adjustments to what they say their output is going to be, which that's a good thing for us as a dealer. If there's less new equipment coming out, as long as it's the right new equipment that there's less of, that'll probably help our used equipment market. Certainly the stability of the prices in our used equipment, but that if they're not putting out as much equipment and another OEM does, market share is going to be impacted certainly, and probably those discussions are going to change a little bit. Performance wise, have we gone through a cycle where the last 3 years have produced enough profit to produce a good valuation or produce enough cash flow to afford something? Do we have the right infrastructure in place? If we've got a 100-year-old dealership, that's great to brag about on your website. Say, yeah, our dealership is 100 years old and our family has owned this thing for 100 years, and it's great. Until you start looking at the pictures and you think, yeah, and you guys haven't done anything to make that dealership look any better in 100 years. And your infrastructure, you need some more buildings, your trucks are out of shape, all this kind of stuff. Your infrastructure isn't kind of ready for some kind of future, then your dealership probably isn't either. And then kind of understanding where we're at in the economic cycle. When we have a big run up in profits like we did from 2019 to 2023, even at the end of before 2024 started, I was already kind of pivoting, understanding that where dealerships are at all-time highs on their prices, and they're at their all-time unknown on what the future looks like. So what that usually means is we're in a merger cycle. Nobody really wants to buy somebody because the risk of valuing the company wrong is too high. They'd rather merge it in and fix it later and say, hey, at least if we merge it in, we're probably wrong on our forecast on both sides, so we're close enough on that, and a merger works. The acquisitions work better when we kind of go the opposite way and say, hey, all of a sudden we've had a couple, 3 bad years with something in there. Looks like it's going to turn the tide in the economic cycle, and this might be a good year for me to buy low so I can kind of hold it and maybe sell it higher later. And then your tax structure as well. Obviously, some of you, if nothing else, you deal with farmers so much during the day that you might think like a farmer when it comes to taxes, and that is, I don't want to pay any. And that usually doesn't work if there's some kind of transaction coming forward that there are things we can do to your tax structure to kind of position you better. But if you haven't looked at that, then that's probably something you got to think about in the future. So why transition planning matters? Statistics, believe them or not, Mark Twain, pardon my French, but this is a quote, so I can say it. Mark Twain once said there's 3 kinds of lies. There's lies there's damned lies, and there's statistics. And so I always hesitate to throw too many statistics up there because I'm never sure who put them together, how well they've actually been tested, or if somebody just made them up in a webinar. So for today, assume that I did not make these up for my webinar. I got these from somebody else. I did get these from the U.S. Economic Census Bureau. So if you trust the government, then you can trust these numbers. But what those will say is business survival rates, particularly closely held or family type business survival rates through the generation. What those success rates look like is only 30% make it to the second generation. Now, first off, I'd say go back to my positive intent earlier and say, you know what, 30% did make it. We can often, too many people go to this one, say 70% fail and after the first generation, and only 13% make it to the next one after that, and only 4% make it to the fourth generation. But it's actually not that much different when you go out and look at a publicly traded company. There aren't very many publicly traded companies even that are 100 plus years old. In fact, when you look back in the 1920s, and this is where statistics kind of come a little suspect, because I'm not sure. 1920s, it says that businesses on average lasted 67 years. That meant at that point somebody had lasted from 1853 to 1920. I don't know how good those statistics were. But we're going to trust them for a second. But it says in the 1920s, businesses last on average 67 years. In 2020, which we have better measurements for, the average lifespan of a company was 21 years, and this is publicly traded companies. And in today, that's already slipped to 18. So from 2020 to today, it's down from 21 years to 18 years success. Now, part of that is, again, there's a lot of speculative companies that start, particular in technology, that get gobbled up pretty quick. And so I don't know if those are failures. They're just not around the next generation. So, but regardless, when you think about why they might not have made it, some more statistics for you. It's supposedly 70% of the companies that failed in that first generation, half of those said they failed because there just wasn't good communication and there wasn't good enough trust between the first generation and the second generation. And something happened in the transition that said we didn't understand what we were getting, we didn't know what we were doing, or we just didn't trust the people that we got it from to continue it. And then 25% just felt that they didn't prepare the next generation to do it. Kind of that same old thing that we hear from everybody. Every one of these conversations that I sit in, particularly in succession planning, goes something like this. The company wasn't handed to me, and these darn millennials just don't understand. And those kind of quotes basically go back forever, whether it was millennials or Gen Xers or what, before we even named the generations. The leaving generation generally thought the succeeding generation wasn't ready for it. So if you're in that boat, I'd challenge you to think a little bit differently, because somebody's got to take over for you. When we talk about transition planning, I want to make sure we don't confuse it with estate planning. Now, estate planning is very important. In fact, estate planning is very important today. So real quick, estate planning, that is how an individual says, I want my stuff to go to these people, either on my death or on unforeseen circumstances, or even in a case of retirement. I want my stuff to be divvied up this way. That can be done with wills or trusts, whether they're simple or complex trusts. That can be done through charity, through life insurance. It can be done a number of ways, but that's not what we're talking about today. But for real quick, I want to touch on it, because if you are an owner on this call that has not dealt with your estate planning or hasn't picked up your estate planning in a few years, I want to remind you that in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act doubled the exemption amounts. So for a husband and wife right now, they can have about $26 million worth of assets, give those away, and then die the next day and not have any estate taxes. That comes to a screeching halt in 2025. And after that, it'll be somewhere around $7 million per person, or $14 million per married couple. So that $26 million will go back down to about $12 to $14 million. And if your company is worth more than that, or is projected to be worth more than that in 2026, you've really given away quite a bit of planning opportunity, because the tax rate, is 40 to 50% in estate planning. And so if you haven't dealt with that, that's a real number. So just an aside, go talk to somebody about your estate planning if you haven't done that. So what we are talking about, though, is succession planning. And it is a plan also for how we're going to transition but it's not necessarily our stuff. We're talking about how to transition leaders from one team to the next without interruption, all while maintaining the capital needed to sustain the company for the long term. Those two play against each other a little bit because when one leadership team leaves, they tend to want to take their golden parachute with them. The bigger their golden parachute is, the harder it is for the next team to afford it, to pay it, to not only survive and pay the current bills, but to pay the old owners off. And so good succession planning deals with both sides of that. That can include retirement staggers or retirement nudging. What I mean by that, sometimes, you know, two brothers started the dealership. Two brothers are 2 years apart from each other. 2 years apart from each other seems like an eternity when you're 8 years old and 6 years old. I'm the big brother and way older than you. When you're 70 years old and your little brother's 68 years old, you're both just old, right? And so you both need to retire at some point. And if you both go at the same time, that's going to generally need a different transition plan than if you stagger that a little bit. And that's an extreme example. If you have 5 or 6 owners, that's different. Some of my most successful dealerships, that's one of the things that we work on from the get-go is we've got 5 or 6 owners. Let's look at the next 10 years. What does our retirement schedule look like, and how do we need to manipulate that a little bit so that the company can afford that when they go out? Another one is retirement nudging. What's that mean? You're old, you're not useful anymore here, and that's an extreme example. We can't ever say that because it stands on egos, but it does. You do get to a point where it's like, man, this company is ready to go to the next level. Some of the ways that some of our older leaders are thinking can't get us there, or they've got so much invested in it they can't see past their personal ambitions and things like that. And so we need to just think about how can we kind of nudge them into retirement so their ego isn't hurt, their cash flow isn't hurt, everybody's treated fairly, but the company can grow after they're gone. It also is going to have to include vetting qualified owners, whether you're going through an M&A transaction or whether you plan on saying, you know what, I want these employees or these kids of mine to own the business afterwards. Regardless, your OEM most likely is going to say, hey, we want to have a little bit of say on that. We want to know what their capital structure looks like. We want to know how well prepared they are financially to sustain, a $20 to $50 million line of credit with us. It's also going to include how do we monetize the investment, and then what do we do with that? You would be surprised, and I'm sure nobody on this phone call is that way, but one of my early discussions in talking about succession and retirement planning and transition planning for my dealers often involves, where else am I going to put my money, Mark? I mean, this dealership has done so good. I just want to own the thing forever. I'm not going to make this kind of money in the stock market. I'm not going to make this kind of money in a CD. But that's kind of short-sighted. What goes up does go down. You're not going to be effective. Your dealership isn't going to be effective if the only thing your dealership is created for was to kick out cash flow to you. And so at some point, it's healthy for you and healthy for the company for you to monetize that investment. M&A is certainly going to be involved at some point. Promotions, demotions, all those kind of things are going to be involved in good succession planning. I can get my slide in. Here we go. So who should be thinking about transition planning? Well, if you're a business that's got multiple generations of owners or heirs, probably most of you. You got similarly tenured owners, management teams. We talked about that a little bit. We've got some retiring leadership coming up, and we don't really have a clear line of transition, or we don't have a clear understanding of what would happen if somebody falls and dies under the proverbial bus. And so if your dealership falls into that, which I can't imagine your dealership not falling into at least one of these buckets, then you should be thinking about transition planning. So are you ever guilty of thinking any of these thoughts? I don't have time to think about transition planning. I'm too busy. I don't know where to start. There are too many people involved and I can't make everybody happy. How can I make a business transition fair for everybody and the next generation particularly? We can't afford to transfer these assets. Next generation is not ready. I don't know who can take over the business, or whatever else you might make up. You've probably said some of those things before. What could go wrong, though, if you don't do some transition planning? Okay, if your retirement dates are all similar for the management team, I just talked about this a little bit. That ain't going to work, right? If you got 5 owners and they're all going to retire within the next couple years, at some point, the last one standing loses. So if you think about that, if you're the 5th owner of the 5 owners that are going out, you don't want to be the last one in place to get that because you had to buy everybody else out. If there's enough money left over at the end of that, when you're the last man, standing, then you probably lose unless we go through this weird cycle where you just happen to time that out right and everybody else sold low and you got to sell high. That's not probably going to work out for you. So a good plan is going to be, let's stagger out those, and more importantly, let's plan those out. Like I said, for most of my successful dealers, we know what the next 10 years looks like. And in that plan is saying, okay, we've said that John is going to retire in 2025, and Bill is going to retire in 2027, and Seth is going to retire in 2031. And if something else comes up that they need to change that date, they've got to give us a year notice. Because if they don't give us a year notice, we're not going to be ready for it. And if they give us a year notice, then we can possibly look at pushing everybody else back or forward a little bit based on that plan. So that can go wrong if we don't plan for that. Assuming that there'll be a one-for-one replacement of a management team. Now, most of us would like to think, oh yeah, totally. We got so many people working here right now. We can be way more efficient in the future. And so three people are doing the job of two people going forward. What we often find is that's the opposite. There are some cases of that. Certainly, there are places on your team where you can be more efficient and that kind of thing. But that's generally down the line a little bit. That's in your middle management level. Your leaders, what we often find is the opposite of that, and it's a guy that is he started out as your HR guy, right? And now he's not only your HR guy, but your controller left. You didn't have a controller, so he's also your controller. He's also your best sales guy. He's also the janitor of this store number 32. That kind of thing. And so what happens? What we've seen is your most successful leaders often are wearing multiple hats, and then it takes quite a bit of capital to get rid of, to once they're gone, we got to pay them out, but we also now got to pay 4 other people instead of 1 other people to do their job. I'm assuming that all management team members need to come from the inside and work their way up. It's a great thought to say, man, people don't understand. Our business is complicated. We're different than most dealerships. Our people are awesome, and that is probably true. But what you'll find out is there are awesome people at other dealerships, or there are awesome people out there that have a great way of thinking about a sales organization like yours that aren't in a dealership right now. They might be in they might be an accountant right now, or they might be working for a finance company, but they understand sales, or they understand capital and leverage, and they might be the next really successful person in your company, such that you've got to make sure you take a look at those people. When good people come in your door, you should probably always interview them. You never know if you're going to need that spot or not. What could go wrong in ownership? So that's in leadership. In ownership, owners not leaving enough time for all aspects of a transition. You can't have whether you're doing monthly, quarterly, or semi-annual board meetings. Most of you are probably doing annual, even worse. But if you got a board meeting and this topic comes up the last couple minutes every other year, and you rush through it and say, we don't have anything coming up, so we'll go kick it on down the road. We'll deal with it later. This takes some time. It takes time to get your dealership ready for it, both from a performance standpoint, from a capital standpoint, from making sure your bankers know what you're doing, making sure your manufacturers know what you're doing. You can't just wake up one morning and say it's time to do some transition. Assuming that the next generation wants to take over the business. They don't. Sometimes they do, but they look at the hours you put in, they look at the capital that's required, and they say, you know what, I can make a lot of money going to work for somebody else. And if you guys don't want me to work for you anymore, I guess I'll go find somebody else to work for. So it's a mistake to think that all of your great employees want to be owners. Assuming that the opposite of that, assuming that nobody internally wants to take over or buy the company, that's also just as dangerous. You've got good people that you don't know how much of their money that they've saved back, or they've made arrangements with the family, say, hey, someday I'm going to have an opportunity to do this. And if you don't call on them, you might have lost an opportunity. Exiting owners fail to consider their future role, if there is one. If the easiest one for me to always do is, you can't be CEO anymore, we'll let you be chairman of the board. What does chairman of the board do? Well, not really anything, but we can't have you be CEO anymore. I spend way too much of my time on M&A transactions, kind of massaging egos a little bit to make sure everybody feels good about the transaction. But the fact is, there is a future role for everybody. Sometimes it's a bigger role, sometimes it's a reduced role, and sometimes it's an absentee role, just filling in at board meetings and kind of hearing report outs versus being involved in management. Failing to have an updated buy-sell agreement. I'm going to talk a lot more about buy-sell agreements in a minute. They're extremely important, and there's a host of other things that go wrong either. And if you are thinking of some questions, you can type those in, and Kim will give them to me later. Okay, so I'm going to switch a little bit to essential steps. How do we make sure that we're ready for a transition? Whether we're talking about a succession plan or M&A or some combination of all those, I always look back and say, what is the one document in our system that actually could deal with this or could have dealt with this better? And what I found is that the biggest one is this buy-sell agreement. Now, some of the people on the phone might say, I don't know if we got a buy-sell agreement. Chances are you do. Most attorneys, no matter how old your company is, built a one paragraph form into the operating agreement that might be called something about restriction on transfer or something like that. But there's something in there that essentially is a first right of refusal type document that says, if you sell your shares of stock, they got to go to this person. They got to go in this. They got to go through this process of being sold, whether that's back to the company or that's to the other owners pro rata or whatever it is. There's probably some restriction on transfer in there. But is that enough? Frankly, no. What do we want to see a good buy-sell agreement do? Well, we want unwanted third parties from taking possession of any part of the company. So when we think about things like some bankruptcies or divorces like that, if we don't have a good lined out buy-sell agreement through no fault of our own, someone else could wind up being an owner that we never anticipated being an owner. But when we do want the ownership to change, we want that buy-sell agreement to enable a smooth transition. We want to provide a method of buying out, withdrawing your deceased owner that honors their input to the company. The last thing we want to have happen is the majority owner to die, and then everybody else says, "Oh, yeah, now that he's gone, there's no way we're going to pay out his wife or his kids this amount of money." We all didn't like him anyway. He wielded a heavy hand towards it, whatever that is. That's not fair, right? When we buy somebody out, they ought to get treated fairly. And if you're dead, you can't represent yourself anymore. And so buy-sell agreement helps that. It also, whether it's a deceased owner, whether it's somebody leaving, we also need to understand that minority and majority have a completely different say in how somebody would be treated, and the buy-sell agreement should help that happen. If you're going into a merger agreement with somebody, and you're going from you own 100% of your company to at best you're going to own 49% of their company. 49% is a whole lot different than 100%, and it's the last decision you get to be in control of when you merge is approving that buy-sell agreement to say, how am I going to be treated if this thing unravels later? So that's why that's pretty important. If you've got a buy-sell agreement and it's more than a couple years old, there's probably a host of reasons why you want to review that regularly and maybe even update it or completely redo it. I see a whole lot of buy-sell agreements that have stagnant or stoic formulas, or some that aren't even formulas at all. I would say 70% of the buy-sell agreements I look at of companies that haven't looked at them in a long time basically say the board sets the value of the company at the annual shareholder meeting or until otherwise changes it. So in other words, we could have had a board meeting back in 2011 and said the value of our company is $8 million. And so we have 1,000, or we have 1,000,000 shares, for each share is worth $8. And then 2012 through 2023 happened, and we forgot that was in there, and we might have an agreement that's so bad that says our company is worth 8 million and we're worth $100 million now. So that's the worst I've seen, and that's pretty darn common. It's probably, like I said, 70% of the buy-sell agreements I've seen. We don't like that. There's other stagnant or stoic formulas that can be in there as well that just say basically, we're going to take EBITDA times X, and the multiple has gone back in the day from 1 to 4, or we're going to take book value and we're just going to take one times book value, and maybe we should be taking 1.2 something or 1.3 something, or whatever the market bears right now. Those formulas need to be updated. We might have had a merger or acquisition, and now all of a sudden we've got multiple agreements because our company is still in place, but it's owned by another company. We got a buy-sell agreement. They got a buy-sell agreement. And all of a sudden now which buy-sell agreement matters, right? And so they could be conflicting with each other. You might have also listened to your accountant like me and said, hey, you know what? To save some taxes, we could take this one company and make it 3 companies, and we could put our trucking over here, and we could put our real estate over here, and we could put our dealership over here, and now we got 3 companies instead of one. We're saving some taxes, we're saving some court costs, if, or some risk if somebody sues us. But now, so we got 3 companies, and they might, some of them might have buy-sell agreements, some might not, but they might not be bound together. So we could wind up having different ownership in each of those 3 companies, which wasn't what we ever planned on happening. So, if you've done that kind of planning, your buy-sell agreement needs updated. You might have done some succession planning movements. So you might have had some stuff in your buy-sell agreement that was tied to the CEO, for instance, or the board members or whatever. And those people have changed. Their ownership has changed. Their title has changed, and we're still tied to what they used to be. We could have also built things based around what the current estate tax law was or the current income tax rates, and now that plan just doesn't work. So any of those are good reasons that I'd say your buy-sell agreement literally needs to be reviewed all the time. I know in our company, we look at our agreements once a year. We have it on the calendar as a board to say, okay, in April or May, one of those 2 months, we're going to make sure we look at all of our agreements again and propose any changes that we think are due for that. For a lot of my dealership companies, not only do we do that, but at the same time, we also we've built in a formula for value to say, hey, here's what the formula is going to be. But now we're going to have our accountant look at that, and we're going to get that blessing, and then we're going to have an ability to make a small change to that if we think the economics are a little bit different. But we're going to know what our value is every year, and it's going to be based on a formula. So those kind of things need to be looked at every year. Now, whether you do it every year or every other year, the point is you can't do it like every 10 years and expect that document to be any good. So as you're looking at it, there's a couple things that we want to make sure you're looking at: design, valuation, and payment terms. So as far as design, we want some flexibility built into your buy-sell agreement. So first right of refusal, that's kind of standard. That's got to be there. And basically, a first right of refusal is just say, if Mark goes to sell his stock, we want this process to happen, and that process might be that the first refusal comes from the company. The company is going to redeem Mark first. If the board of the company says no, we're not in a position to do that, then the other owners can do it pro rata, or certain owners can do it based on what we laid out. And if none of those people want to buy it, then Mark still has the ability to go sell a stock, but we have a right to match it, those kind of things. So we at least need that first right for refusal. Oftentimes, that's all your buy-sell agreement does say is the first right of refusal. I don't think that's enough, but it at least needs to have that. We probably also want a second or a third right of refusal. So if you think about a merger situation where this dealership used to be owned by this family, and this dealership used to be owned by this family. They merged together, and now we've got this dealership up here. Well, the agreement we're worried about is the buy-sell agreement up here at the top level. But we might say down here, these family members can sell to each other or to their company first, or these family members can sell to each other or their company first before it goes up to this one. So that's why I come back to a second or a third kind of right of first refusal. We might have restrictions that need to agree with our OEM. So like it or not, our OEMs loan us a bunch of money. They send us a bunch of tractors and they floor plan it, and so they do have they do have some ability to make life hard on us if we don't do things right. And so in fairness, it's only fair that they have some restrictions, right? So some of those restrictions might be that the owner has to have a certain amount of equity outside of the dealership, or that owner can't own other brands of dealerships, those kind of things. So we want to make sure that the restrictions in our buy-sell agreement don't conflict with something that the OEM might say as well. We want to make sure that formula or some kind of way to change the value is in there every year, and not just a way to change it, but a way to say, I know how it's going to change. So again, in this situation, we've got the 2 families. When we value those companies to come together, we knew what we were doing, right? Because we were in control, and then we came together. At some point, the decision's made up here, not down here, right? And we want to know, how is that going to be valued? Well, the easiest way to do that is to put a value, or to put a formula in place in your buy-sell agreement that says we're going to value the company exactly the same in the future as we did for this merger. So we're going to look at EBITDA, or we're going to look at book value, or we're going to look at whatever we're going to look at. We're going to put this kind of multiple on it, and that's how we're going to value the company. That, to me, is the best way to design a buy-sell agreement, because now a minority owner knows exactly what the change is going to be in the future. It's not going to be some arbitrary thing that he doesn't get to control. It's going to be something that changes, but something that he knows how it changes. We also want to know how the voting is going to happen if something does change outside of that. Like, say we're going to make some other change. We're going to change the first right of refusal to go from being company to pro rata first or something like that. Is that a vote that takes place from the shareholders? Or is that a vote that takes place by the board? Is it a vote that is 51% wins, or is it a vote that 75% wins, with a majority or super majority kind of thing? So defining that early matters. It's always easier to make these kind of decisions when everybody likes each other, because at some point you're not going to like each other if a decision like this is being made and you don't think it lines up with how you want it to be made. You want to know you're going to have a say. If there's a tie to employment, I've got a bunch of dealerships still that have agreements that say if you're not working for this dealership, you don't get to own it. That used to be great. Now all of a sudden we need a lot of capital. You might not want that. If that is what your agreement says now, that you might want that changed. We want to know that it's tied to the other related entities, and then there's some triggering events. In my world, I always build these triggering events into buy-sell agreements. Retirement being one that I want somebody that worked for the company all their life, and they gave us sufficient notice that they're going to retire. I want them to be assured they're going to get 100% of their value. On the other hand, if somebody doesn't give me sufficient notice and they leave, they come and take this job and shove it kind of thing and say, I'm gone tomorrow. I believe there should be a trigger that changes the value to them because we weren't ready for that capital wise. If they did something to screw up the company, make the company look bad, make the company lose some money, do something that makes them get fired, there also ought to be a trigger that says, hey, they shouldn't get paid full value because they did something that put the company in a different capital position. Dying is kind of like retirement. Same with disability. Through no fault of their own, and they weren't able to give the notice that our buy-sell agreement required. But you know what? They gave their all while they were alive or able-bodied with us, and we should make sure that they're treated fairly. In bankruptcy, the thing is, bankruptcy and divorce both. It's not about kicking somebody while they're down and saying, "Hey, we're gonna put a trigger on this to decrease your value." It is more along the lines of we don't want the bank to accidentally be an owner of our company. We don't want an ex-wife to be or an ex-husband to be an owner of us, because they won't be bound by that same buy-sell agreement. They might pull a capital event to us and say, hey, I want out. I want you to liquidate this that we weren't ready for. And again, there ought to be a trigger on that. So that's why we say there's triggering events for there. As far as valuation methodologies, when we look at buy-sell agreements, there's basically three ways to value a company, whether you're merging, whether you're buying, selling, giving it to somebody, whatever, you still need to know the value of the company. There's three ways we look at this. One is looking at future anticipated results. A lot of those that you'll hear about, the main one is discounted cash flow. So we go through and we figure out what our future sales, our future margins, our future EBITDA, our future cash flow, what that's all going to look like in the future. Figure out what the riskiness of the company is, and we discount that cash flow or that EBITDA or whatever it is back to today's market. Sales, gross margin, EBIT, or sales and gross margin, I usually don't recommend that in the dealership world, because sales, for one, don't matter at all. Sales are for bragging about, yeah, I'm a $100 million company, but if you had 1% margin, you're not a $100 million company, you're a $1 million company. So I'd rather look at gross margin than sales, if nothing else. And then if we've got a bunch of expense load, I'd rather look at EBITDA than anything else. But EBITDA, again, in the future, I don't necessarily care about EBITDA. I can't spend EBITDA, I can spend cash. So the difference between EBITDA and cash in the future is generally how much of that's going to be required for inventory and maintenance of my fleet and things like that. So I want to know what cash flow looks like in the future, discount that back to today. Historical results, the most common that we see there are net asset value or book value, and EBITDA. If you're new to the concept, EBITDA is just your net income. You add back your interest and your taxes and your depreciation and your amortization. And taking those two together, we can figure out what the company's worth. It's going to have some goodwill component to it. Some of the things that have changed are just to keep in mind, cash flow, for instance, looking at future anticipated cash flow results, we discount that back based on a risk rate. The beginning of risk rate is the risk-free rate or the treasury rate, the bank that the government loans the bank's money. Back a few years ago, that was 0. Then fast forward to 2022, it was about 1%, and now today it's 5.4%. So the risk-free rate is 5.4%. We build on risk from there. availability of inventory, risk of the market you're in, how protected your border is on your AOR, what's your succession plan look like? Do you have people to take over? We build all those on top of the risk. But when we went from the baseline of being 0 or 1% to 5.5% now, the valuations have gotten beat up a little bit on that discount cash flow model. On the flip side, for EBITDA purposes, we've had year after year after year, 2020, 21, 22, year after year after year of record growth, record EBITDA. And dealerships go from $15 million in net income to $48 million in net income, or dealers that had $3 million in net income to having $12 million in net income. And so all of a sudden we're at a high. So those EBITDA numbers, if we're looking at a modeling value off of EBITDA, dealerships are at an all-time high, even with the challenges we're having in 2024, because even on a rolling 12, we're still in pretty good shape. We're way better than we were in 2019, for instance. Net asset value, those can tend to get beat up based on, was there some prior goodwill from a merger that we're amortizing? Is there some, are we depreciating our equipment faster than we probably oughta? Because nobody puts a residual value on depreciable assets anymore. They depreciate everything down to 0. I know as an accountant that's one of the things that bugs me. I go back to my college days and remember, hey, there was always residual value. We don't really look at those anymore. But anyway, we beat up net asset value. So when I look at the values right now, cash flow is kind of low, EBITDA is kind of high, net assets is also kind of low. So that leads me to say a better dealership answer for the long term, so that we don't have these artificial highs and these artificial lows based on what the market's doing today versus what the market's doing over a 3 to 5 year period. I'd rather combine valuation methods, and maybe it's all 3 of those. Oftentimes, I'll tell you, my dealerships, it's all 3 of those. Then we just have to figure out what the right weighting is on each formula to say, we're going to be, the one we know the least amount, the one that we're the least sure on is that cash flow because it's going forward. So we'll put a 20 or 30% number on that. The next one we're least sure of is EBITDA. Now, EBITDA itself is a prior number. We know it, right? So there's no uncertainty about what our prior EBITDA was. The uncertainty is knowing whether or not we can continue to produce that EBITDA in the future. So I also don't want to put too big of a value on the EBITDA because it assumes that the future is going to look just like the past. And if we're just coming off a high 3 years or a low 3 years, we need to know that we've got an ability to adjust that in the future. Net asset value is the one that we know absolutely the most about. It's what do I own? What has the company got in it today? What are the hard assets that I'm going to get? So I put the highest value typically on that. And what that does is it gives me some ability to say, to capture that future growth. It gives me some ability to say what's the worst case scenario on the net asset value, and it gives me a little bit of certainty in saying my infrastructure in the past has created this kind of EBITDA. I'm fairly certain that that infrastructure is still in place to produce some version of that EBITDA in the future. So that's why I believe that a combination of those valuation methods is probably the way for you to go. I just went one slide too many, just a second. I double clicked instead of single click. There we go. So then the last thing on a buy-sell agreement is the payment terms. And these can be just as important, because it's one thing we come back and we say, hey, the value of the company is X. We don't say how we're going to pay it. Then that assumes that we're going to pay it all at one day. That's expensive. Or it might assume that we're going to pay it all in cash. That's also expensive. So what are our options? We can self-fund it. In other words, the dealership builds up cash and says, hey, we've got this cash that we're saving, whether it's in an investment, whether it's in a bank account, or whether it's in the dealership has the money to buy out our owners. We might do it through life insurance for obvious reasons. If the owner's dead, then we can get some accelerated money from life insurance. And I'd say definitely there should always be life insurance on your key man, and some ability of your some version of covering the value for your key owners. We can borrow that money. We can borrow that money from several people: the bank, a former shareholder, or other related entities that just want to loan us money. We might, in that scenario, we've got the trucking company and the real estate company. The real estate company might have an ability to borrow money better than our operating company because they've got real estate that we can go get loaned up on. It might be that we borrow from them. And they borrow it from somebody else, kind of thing. So there's a host of opportunities there. Now, what we need to know is what the interest rates are going to be, what the terms are going to be. Are we going to pay that over 5 years, 7 years? We're going to have balloon payments, those kind of things. But those are important to set those up front, not to say, oh, you know what, we'll deal with it when we get there. That doesn't give me, as a minority owner, very much confidence that I'm going to be hurt. And then flexibility needs. I talked about it before, with retirement age, this one's a little bit different. What this says is if you retire when you're 55 years old and you give us plenty of notice and all that, that's one thing. We're not gonna pay you out possibly until you're 65, or maybe that's what I want, or maybe that's what I say is like, you know what, I'm selling out because I want to go. I got enough money to go see the world. But when I retire, I want my money there. You know what? That's fine. I'm funding my own retirement there because now you got a 10-year ability to kind of pre-fund that and get some interest money on it beforehand. There might also be an exemption in there, and I think that's one of those at the end: covenant compliance, deferrals, or delays. If you're for instance, if your manufacturer, your bank says, hey, you got to have a tangible equity ratio of 25 or 30% or whatever that number is. If paying an old owner means I'm going to go below the 25 or 30% number for no other reason, that's going to take me down, then I want to build in an ability to defer some of that to keep me above a covenant compliance issue. Mark's going to get paid. He's going to get paid later. We're going to give him that interest on it. We just can't pay him this year. We're going to defer $100,000 of it to next year. We're going to defer $100,000 to the end, whatever that might look like. But it gives it a way for the company to survive, because ultimately, if the company goes broke buying out a prior owner, they're probably going to go broke before they buy the prior owner completely out. So it's good for everybody, for the company not to go broke just because somebody retires or wants to sell out. So those are the flexibility needs that we need to get put in there. So with that, I am about out of time. I guess the question, the statement I would make would be, with any of these transitions, the important thing is start early, talk about it a lot, and always kind of focus on this kind of future you of what are the changes, opportunities, what are the expansions, successions, retirements, and ultimately what's the legacy we can leave to our communities and our owners and our shareholders and our employees to say, hey, this is we built the company we meant to, and we funded it, and we made it, and we party at the end that we did it right. So, Kim, I don't know if you got any questions or not, but
none have come in, but I will open it up for people to ask any questions if they haven't. We do have a few minutes. While they maybe type, what would you say is the biggest, whether it comes to just general succession planning or putting these buy-sell agreements together, what's the biggest mistake you see dealers make most often?
probably the biggest mistake is they don't re-look at the documents. And I understand that they pay their accountant or their attorney a whole bunch of money to put all these documents in place. There was a lot of good planning that went into them, and you look back at it and say, we did that in 2013. That wasn't that long ago, but 3 years is a very long time in a dealership world. When we look at the cycles of economics, in 3 years we've gone up and down, and basically everything in between has been replaced. And so dealerships look completely different every 2 or 3 years, and to not look at that stuff often is probably the biggest mistake.
All right. All right. No one.
And my contact information on here, I put it on there, including my cell phone. I don't mind. If the questions come up later, they can reach out to me. If it turns into a project, great. If it's just answering a question, that's fine too. I'm kind of here I'm here for the dealership group. So.
All right. Well, with no other questions, then we will wrap things up. Like I had mentioned earlier, today's presentation and audio will be available on the Farm Equipment website in the event you want to go back and review it or share it with anyone else at the dealership. Keep an eye on your email and the Farm Equipment newsletter for more information on when that's available. On behalf of Mark, the Pinion team, and the Farm Equipment staff, thanks for joining us for today's webinar. Feel free to reach out to me if there's any topics you'd like to see us cover in the future. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.